Good evening. Wow, there we go. Yeah. Well, welcome to what I think is the fifth session of our study of this book. That the further in we go, the more I'm impressed with Truman's attention to detail. Working through things so carefully. Excuse me while I get the little clicker here out of the pulpit. All right. And so this is our, as I said, our fifth session, but it's over our third chapter, so be ye not confused. And I think that Mr. Frank was being chatty in the fellowship hall, so he hasn't caught up with us quite yet, but I might just wait until he gets in here to thank him for covering the teaching for me last week. He was meant to teach for me 2 Wednesdays ago. Of course, that's when the snowpocalypse arrived, and so we had to cancel the whole thing, and we had to delay it 1 week. And he was, and so the session just decided to go ahead and move him 1 week and give me the next Wednesday off, so that I could continue to enjoy all the newness of married life. And which by the way, just in passing, I highly recommend marriage. I see that as I survey the room, I don't need to, but I do, even so, highly recommend it. So we're going to be talking about chapter 3 tonight, which focuses on Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And there he is. Mr. Frank, I was just saying how much I appreciated you covering the teaching last week. Thank you. You gave us a reflection on the story of Joseph, a story that, of course, necessarily occurs within a Near Eastern cultural milieu, and one that you yourself, an Eastern milieu that you're familiar with.
Yeah. We don't think about it, but Joseph saved the Jewish nation.
That's right. That's right. Well, why don't we pray, and then we'll begin our exploring our content tonight. Father, thank you for the gifts that you've given to your people. We've just been reminded that you answer our prayers for daily bread by supplying us with food. You answer our prayers in all seasons by supplying us with fellowship with your people. You answer your, you as it were, you give us this visual reality of your promise that your people and your promises are going to continue forever by giving us a church, a place to worship and be together. And you've given us a church not just local, but a church global and universal, and so that we can benefit from the wisdom of your servant, Carl Truman. We thank you for him, and ask that you would continue to use this book and our conversations in here to get a sense of being oriented to our present moment. Reminded in the Old Testament of the men of the tribe of Issachar, who it was said of them that they understood the times, and so they were equipped to advise the people of Israel what to do. So let it be with this class, that we would learn together how to, not just how to give a response, but how to be aware of where our neighbors are, where our children are, that we might be able to speak intelligently and lovingly to them in Jesus' name. Amen. And so, I get the sense that Truman, at this point in the book, is still kind of marshaling his force, still kind of gathering his energy, as it were. And so he's chosen to focus intently on one specific person in the third chapter, and that is Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the foundations of modern selfhood. And I was really struck, just as I read, again, as I have been through any time he brings up somebody in history, just how familiar it all sounds. He does a very good job of basically saying, hey, look, here's the connection. Let me prove it to you, and then he proves it to you. All right, so then let's begin. On page 106, on page 106, Truman starts talking, kind of gives you this refresher on some of the content we've covered so far on psychological man, okay, which is a shorthand for saying psychological man is the mindset that permeates our present cultural moment, and it has for some time, and that's that real self-discovery happens in the inner life. right? And that if you have a problem, it can probably be answered through therapy and working it out, but that this mind and the life inside the mind can become very important. He traces that all the way back to St. Paul and Augustine. Really interesting. He says on page 106, there was only at best a very vague concept of the will in classical philosophy. It was only when Paul offers his own psychological account of the Christian's inner struggle in his first century New Testament letters, which was then picked up and developed in a deeply and elaborate way by Augustine in his Confessions at the end of the 4th century, that we find the basic tools for conceptualizing humans as primarily psychological beings, right? So what's he talking about there? I mean, a few places might come to mind. For me, the most obvious one would be Romans 7, where Paul has this kind of inner struggle where he says, the very thing I want to do, I don't do, and the very thing I want to do, the very thing I want to do, I don't do, and the thing I don't want to do is the thing I do, I end up doing. And so, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of sin? And so that's one example, just again, of this internal conflict. He talks about he talks about spiritual warfare and the kind of the internal war that happens in the mind and the heart of the Christian. And then Augustine really unpacks this idea. Well, does he unpack it, or does he just kind of use it in his Confessions? It's hard to overstate how important Augustine's Confessions are. We take for granted that today, if you want to kind of gain a sense of control, gain a sense of understanding of your own surroundings of your life and what's happening, especially if you've gone through some kind of trial, that you might sit down and journal it. Like journaling is a thing that if you're in a difficult time in life and somebody suggests that you journal, that's not going to sound like some grand revelation. We know what journaling is, and we know to some extent it's sort of in the cultural consciousness that has some power to order your life, right? So it's difficult to overstate just how much Augustine gave that idea to us by writing this book called Confessions. It's been said that all Christian theology since Augustine is basically commenting on whatever Augustine started talking about. So that's just how influential he was over theology, at least Western theology anyway. And so from there we get this idea that like you by yourself can work out yourself. That's exactly what Augustine kind of does is in his Confessions. He writes this whole autobiography, a spiritual autobiography. And then he gets to the end and he kind of reflects on the nature of memory. And like, so how powerful is it that I can remember what happened when I'm 7 and use it to kind of understand what God is doing in life? All right, so then let's move on then to this guy who's going to absorb a lot of our conversation this evening, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He shaped the idea of what it means to be a self. I'm on page 107. So he writes a book, kind of the mid to later years of his life, and he calls it Confessions. The parallel is intentional. Even though he doesn't mention Augustine at any point, it's pretty obvious that it's meant to be a counterpoint to Augustine. Truman says that in 108. And so he starts in 109 talking about these 3 key moments in that book by Rousseau. And he starts with Rousseau's moment of stealing the asparagus. I'm rather going to start with Augustine's moment of stealing the pears. Skip past this part. The world in your mind, that's where we were starting. That Truman credits Paul and Augustine with this idea that you can live inside, so to speak, live inside the world in your head and use it to understand yourself. And so you have this scene depicted here of Augustine, St. Augustine after stealing the pears. So here's what happened. St. Augustine in the Confessions tells this story about how he and his buddies stole some pears. Have I talked about this story in here? I don't know if I've talked about it in this. Okay. It's one of my favorite stories in terms of understanding our doctrine of sin. So Augustine is a young man or even young boy, and he's with his friends, and they see a neighbor's pear tree. And the pears don't look good to eat. They don't look appetizing. They don't taste good. They're not even the proper right time. And they go and they steal them. They just pull them off the tree. And then as it turns out, they're not even hungry. They take the pears and they feed them to a bunch of pigs, and they're laughing the whole time that they do it. And Augustine goes on and on about this moment in his life in the Confessions. Really, he's scandalized by it. He considers it one of the worst sins he's ever committed. And again, if you're a modern Westerner reading it, you're like, really? That's the worst thing you've ever done? That's the worst thing you have to complain about is you stole a handful of pears from a neighbor's tree? But then he gets to the reason why. And he basically says, I wasn't even hungry. Like, that's the real sin of it. I stole the pears for the sheer thrill of the sin. Right? I couldn't even justify that I was hungry and that I wanted them to feed myself. I just wanted to sin, and I wanted that thrill. And that's why it's the worst kind of sin. It's not because we have any other reason other than we just want the thrill of the sin. And so, sorry, I lost my place in my notes here. Right, and so then we get to Rousseau's Confessions many years later, where he tells a story about how he stole some asparagus from a fellow named Monsieur Verrat, or rather from Verrat's mother. Verrat's the one that talked him into it. And so he analyzes this moment in his life, Rousseau does, and he says, his analysis is the motivation wasn't greed, which, by the way, Augustine would say as well. It wasn't that he was greedy. That wasn't the motivation. But Rousseau says the motivation was that another guy made me do it. Right? So another guy pressured me into it and goaded me and really, kind of put the pressure on me so that I would do it. And so I stole to help my friend. And so Rousseau evaluates that and says, good desire, poorly executed. Right? Whereas Augustine says, evil desire, to engage in evil for evil purposes, and so therefore I'm the problem, I'm the sinner. Rousseau says, I had a good desire, but didn't execute it properly, and it came from these outside pressures and outside forces. All right, and so for Rousseau, human corruption is created and fostered by social conditions. Okay? Created and fostered by social conditions. That is, it's not innate. Rousseau sees all of his corruptions or problems or failures as the fault of something or someone in society. So you've probably heard this expressed in some way before, along the lines of we're born basically good, and it's society that messes us up. That's Rousseau. Okay, that's the root of this idea. So this is the contrast for Augustine. I was supposed to mention this on page 110. Yeah. Okay. Indeed, Truman says, in the context of the Confessions as a whole, that is Rousseau's Confessions, the story comes immediately after his acquisition of numerous vices, lots of vices. He's got lots of what we would call sin problems in his life, but they're each the result of social conditions in the world in which he found himself. His master treated him badly. That's why he started lying and became lazy. His father punished him too harshly. That made him manipulative and covetous. Society, or at least the society in which he found himself, is to blame for the young Rousseau's delinquency. His corruption is essentially the result of his reaction to corrupting circumstances. Okay? So this is the contrast then. For Augustine, the theft is not the result of a good desire misdirected. It's just simply a sinful desire. Augustine blames himself for his sin because he's wicked from birth. Okay? Rousseau blames society for his sin because he's basically good at birth and then is perverted by external forces. All right? And so this is, of course, the old debate between nature and nurture. Right? Is this my sinful nature, or am I sort of nurtured to be this way? Now, I don't think any of us would object that society and family of origin and early experiences can have a really formative effect on who you are and who you become, and even on the proclivities that you have towards certain kinds of sins. Okay, if you grow up with some trauma in your life, then you're going to find that there are going to be certain kinds of sins and even sin patterns that are going to be more difficult for you. That's quite a world away, though, from saying that you're born basically good. You have a good nature that just gets messed up by a group of people, all of whom presumably all have another good nature, If you trace that back far enough, when does the corruption start? Maybe some of you were already working on that for me. Yeah,
Those
Mr.
people
Frank.
that say we were born, kind of with a clean slate, have not dealt with children very much.
Yeah, Mr. Frank said if you think we're born with a clean slate, you probably have not dealt with children. I can't remember if Rousseau was the one who didn't have any children, or that he sent them all to the orphanage. That's right. That's right. Thank you. That's what I thought. What? Yeah, because he was so good. It was probably society's fault. Yeah. So for Rousseau, the social order then is a source of falsehood or inauthenticity, right? So it's the social order, it's society that keeps you from being your authentic self.
They deal with where the evil in society comes from if it's made of all good people.
Yes, he's going to get to that. Because that was my question as well. So he said, men and women are born good, so says Rousseau, and then are corrupted by the society that surrounds them. Perhaps this idea exists and continues today, and it got me thinking, maybe chew on this for a moment. Perhaps this is part of why, at least in our present cultural moment, we tend to obsess over presidential races, because we believe it's the president's job to fix the society that's screwing everybody up. Just, I don't know, maybe something to think about. Is that why some people get so passionate over politics? It's because politics is what they're hoping in to fix the society that's messing everybody up. I don't know. So he tells the story, and I'm still kind of ruminating on this and trying to figure out exactly how it connects. I don't think Truman is explicit, but he tells the story about how he falls in love with this prostitute, and that Rousseau tells the story about he sees this prostitute in the Confessions, who she's just unbearably beautiful. He can't even stand to look at her. He sort of trembles in her presence, type thing. And then, just for the sake of decency, I'm not going to tell you what he sees, but let's just say he notices she has a physical flaw. And at that point, he's like free. He's like, okay, no, now she's an ugly monster to me. And that moment for him was really, really formative, apparently, because it gave him a sense. How did Truman put it? The question as to why he regards it so critical, he gets on to in a later point. But he arrives in. Let me see. He's leaving Paris to go visit a friend and sees a copy of this newspaper where he reads about an essay competition being held by the Academy of Dijon, and the question on which contestants are asked to write is this: whether the restoration of the sciences and arts has contributed to the purification of morals, right? In other words, we've got these universities. Have they made us better people? Okay? We've got this society that has music and science and art and mathematics and all that. Has it made us better? Has it contributed to the purification of morals? And so he starts writing and reflecting on this question. And for him, this really is, he writes of it in his Confessions as though it's like a conversion moment. Listen to the language. This was in a footnote. The language Rousseau uses about this moment is akin to those used in evangelical conversion stories. Quote, "The moment I read these words," that is the title of the proposed essay, "I saw another universe, and I became another man." So it's like when he begins to see clearly and sees that no, it hasn't made us better. This society that we've built up is making us worse, right? And so that's so transformative for him. It's a good reminder that conversion moments, whether we might call them evangelical conversion moments or conversion moments of another sort like this one, are incredibly powerful and incredibly formative. So whatever somebody grabs hold of in those moments, rest assured it will be very difficult to talk them out of it. The old statement, there's no zealot like a convert. So it's interesting to me then that should give us pause in how we are discipling people. How are we wanting to usher people into understanding Christianity? Okay. All right. Any questions so far? Let me ask you any questions so far. All right. So he believes that there's this problem with society, and even, and when society he includes arts and sciences and the like, and the problem is that society gives people a need to belong to it, obviously. If I am living in a society, whether it's a city or I'm going to a school or I'm part of a church, I want to be known, or at the very least I don't want to be threatened. I want to be safe, but to some extent I want to be appreciated for the work that I do. I want the good work that I do to be recognized, regardless of kind of my place in the community, whatever that place is. So it gives people a need to belong to it, and then, according to Rousseau, requires them to be false to who they really are. In other words, it gives them a Sittlichkeit, if you remember that word from a previous chapter. Basically, the Sittlichkeit is the code of behavior that your society gives you. The code of behavior that you have to conform to in order to be accepted, right? And so to get there and to talk about that, beginning on page 116, we start talking about these two loves, right? And that's when things got a little clearer for me in regard to this question. So how does society corrupt people? How exactly does that work? So he talks about two different kinds of love, and really there are two different kinds of self-love. So the first kind of self-love is... I actually don't know how to pronounce this in French. Let's just go with self-love unless somebody wants to call that pronunciation out to me. It's only used once, and so I only heard Truman say it once on the audio, and then he moves on to this other kind. But the first kind of self-love is this. I want to make sure that myself is protected. So I want clothes, I want a house, I want food, and perhaps I want... somebody to get married to and to have children with. Okay, so insofar as that's like self-love, wanting those things for yourself, and Rousseau says that's good. It's a good kind of self-love. Human beings should have that. They should want those things for themselves. But then there's this second kind, amour propre, which is what French term, amour propre, which is a self-love that manifests as. So now we've moved beyond I want clothes, I want love, I want a home, I want to be safe, to I want honor, I want recognition, I want greatness. Okay? And Rousseau says when people start to want those things, they want them because they're in a society with other people, and they get the idea in their head that they want to be better than. Okay? And so once we get in with all these other people, there's this, at least as I understand it, at least the temptation to pursue honor, recognition, greatness, which then creates competition. And so that for Rousseau is the big problem, this amour propre, which creates competition with my neighbor. Okay? And that's when things go bad. That's when I start to see you as threatening what I might want, either getting there first or keeping me from it. So let's see, from page 118, he says, it is the alien demands of the environment, that is, to be better than this other person, to be more beautiful than that one, that corrupts individuals and alienates them from who they really are. Okay, so that's my kind of first answer to what does he see as the root. This for Rousseau is the real baddie in the plot, the real poison in the soup. Is that if you're in a society, the society is going to bind you to rules, and it's going to give you, in a sense, a game to play, and you're going to want to win, right? And so that's what's going to set you at odds with your neighbors. Again, his alternative is not necessarily, well, actually, I don't know if I can say that, because from Rousseau we also get this idea of the noble savage, which still exists today. If you don't believe me, watch Pocahontas. Okay? If you don't believe me, watch Avatar. That's the noble savage idea. So you have these people who are living in like relative peace and harmony, and then the evil corporation or evil colonialists come in and mess everything up. Yeah, that's Rousseau. That's a perfect example of the Rousseauian ideal. And so you can have, apparently in Rousseau's thinking, you can have cultures and societies that are basically good, as long as they don't get super competitive. As long as they keep front and center that good kind of self-love. I need clothes, I need food, I need somebody to get married to, I need kids, and these sorts of things. But as long as that doesn't sort of get ignited into competition, which is where the problems start. So that's why in Pocahontas and in Avatar, what's the root of the problem? The problem is that the outsiders want something. They want to steal something. They're greedy. They want to soak up all the resources or what have you. I even think what's that one with the fairies? Fern Gully. I don't know if maybe that's too far back, but that's which is which is propaganda to some extent, but it was still a funny movie. So anyway, so then what is the solution? How do you kind of navigate some of that? What's kind of how do human beings aim to be better than in a Rousseauian world? Well, for Rousseau, he narrows it down to basically one virtue, and if you can grasp this one virtue, then it's going to make everything better for a lot of us. And does anybody know what that is? Pity, and at times Truman also says empathy. So for Rousseau, pity is the most universal virtue on page 120 and 121. Pity is something that's always directed toward another, and so again, it's going to kind of have this other-centered ethic. And so for Rousseau, pity is the most universal virtue, and so it takes the place of laws and morals because it moves us toward the suffering of others. And for Rousseau, if you're moving in the direction of the suffering of others and not thinking of them in terms of being in competition with them, then we solve the amour propre problem, okay? So for him, the foundation of ethics was pity. Basically, you should exercise appropriate self-love against self-protection. That's fine. Be happy with that. And then pity others when they suffer. Problems emerge when you seek to dominate others rather than take pity. So the virtuous person then is the one whose instincts and emotions and emotional responses are rightly attuned. And he said this has to originate in the heart of the individual. Thank you. This has to originate in the heart of the individual because... sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Because laws can't change hearts. Now again, you may have detected little bits that we can agree with in here. It's like, well, no, pitying your neighbor and moving toward their suffering is good. That's a very Christian ideal. And then reading the bit in Rousseau about how laws can't change hearts, I was like, well, yeah, we agree with that too. And so there you can see bits in here, and even Rousseau makes this very, very strong appeal to conscience. We're going to get there in a moment. So this has implications then. This is powerful implications. And one example that Truman gives is education. Right? So what is the purpose of education? I've been the chairman of a school board for almost a year now. And so I've begun thinking a lot more about education questions than I ever have before in my life. I bet Robbie has too. But is education about training individuals to be contributing members of society, to understand their culture, to understand their history, to understand where they fit in it? In a Rousseauian world, the answer is absolutely not. Why would you train people to fit into the thing that's corrupting them? Yeah? So in a Rousseauian world, and from his perspective, education then is about allowing a person to mature in a manner that protects them from cultural influences. You have to protect their precious their precious individualism, right? Okay, I mean, I'm having a little fun there, but seriously, so you can see how this then takes root. And one of the most fascinating things, I wish I had like saved a clip of the article, or at least maybe a bit from the interview. But there were some I don't remember if it was CNN or MSNBC or just one of these mainstream news organizations that was interviewing, and this was months ago, interviewing teachers who were public school teachers who more and more were having to, as you know, move online and do a lot of their teaching online, which means now for a lot of these public school teachers, all of a sudden there was a parent in the room when they were teaching. Well, that's never happened before. Right? You have this freedom to form young minds, and the parents are not in the building. And they were interviewing some of these, at least teachers who were willing to get on camera and say that they were really uncomfortable with that idea. and saying, like, really, we're really kind of concerned that they might interfere with what we're trying to do. Really? How fascinating. I probably shouldn't say anything else about that. I'm going to get myself in trouble. But yeah, and again, what is the purpose of education? I think for a lot of people, it's they understand. So let me say this: education is to form character. It's always going to do that. I don't care where you go to school or what your educational philosophy is. Right? If you go to public school, if you go to private school, if you homeschool, if you go to to some magnet school, I don't care what kind. If you charter school, that's the other category I left out. It's going to form your character. And they're either going to be honest about that or maybe not entirely clear about that. But any kind of educational system is going to give you a set of morals that you've got to listen to and conform to. So let's see. Right, so from Rousseau's perspective, education's about allowing a person to mature in a manner that protects them from cultural influence, because if they're not protected from cultural influence, what's going to happen? It's only going to inflame this, right? This is only going to get a lot worse from Rousseau's perspective. And so that's going to make you then inauthentic. Every time, honestly, let me just share something personal with you on this matter. Every time I see the word authentic or inauthentic, I cannot help but think of this poor young man. When I didn't know him well. I didn't know him at all, excuse me. I didn't know him at all. But he was a student at Liberty when I was still living in Lynchburg, Virginia at the time. I had graduated from Liberty. And at that time, there were at least a couple of movies out, and I don't remember what they were, but essentially they were like these kind of sort of postmodern type films that focused on the kind of individual journey inside this guy's head and his reflections on life. And what he would do is he would like stand on train tracks and look into the sunset and just really like try to comprehend the mysteries of life. And this was living authentically. And because he was out in the middle of nowhere on these train tracks, and it was a bit dangerous, really. I'm thinking of like suspended bridges where the train goes over, stuff like that, and you're standing on the edge, and that's living authentically. Well, there was a kid in Lynchburg, Virginia, who decided to live authentically, and he died because a train hit him. Yes, and so it really like, and what was interesting to me, the reason why I bring it up is not like to mock the kid who died, I promise, but the reason I bring it up is because what happened immediately was that particularly a lot of my former professors kind of were on social media, and they were saying, this is dumb, this is not authentic living, this is stupidity, and actually got pushback on social media from other strangers and random folks who just said, why don't you leave the kid alone? He was trying to be his authentic self. I was like, wow, man, this has a much deeper hold even then than I thought. I was amazed that anybody would disagree with like, just maybe don't stand on train tracks, it's not good for your health. The problem, so for Rousseau, the problem comes when there's no consensus. For Truman, excuse me. The problem comes, though, when there's no consensus about what should evoke our pity and our empathy. Okay? That's where we are right now. So in our cultural moment, empathy is the highest good. I would state that unequivocally. I would welcome objections to that, but I'm pretty well convinced that empathy is like the highest good in our culture right now. So let me briefly, this is not in the chapter, I think Truman's going to get to it later, give you the difference between empathy and sympathy, okay? Because I'm going to share with you my conviction. Sympathy is required for the Christian. Absolutely required for the Christian, absolutely biblical, fundamentally important. Empathy can be dangerous if you it's like a explosive chemical if you don't know what it is you're handling, okay? So let me talk about this distinction. Sympathy is when someone is suffering and you ache for them, okay? And so their suffering, as it were, pulls you toward them. It kind of moves you in, and then even after you've left, they're still in your brain, okay, and your heart, and so that provokes you then to pray for them, or maybe bring them a meal, or whatever have you, okay. That sympathy, that's good, right? Empathy is I'm going to get inside of your shoes and understand everything that you feel about your experience, and I'm going to let it be true. Right? You see the difference. So if I'm talking with someone who, let's just create a scenario that never, ever, ever happens, which is, let's say that somebody's in a church and they get their feelings hurt over something stupid, okay? That never happens, but let's just pretend that it could, right? And so empathy would be, oh, I can't believe what that dirtbag said to you. That dirtbag really is a dirtbag. What kind of dirtbag is that, and why is he in church? That's really terrible. I'm sorry that happened to you. You know what? You're right. You should never go back to that church again. Not if they treat you like that, right? That's empathy, because at no point is there can we talk about what you said to him, though? Can we talk about how this bitterness is eating you alive? Can we talk about how maybe there's like sin on both sides of this conflict here? And again, that doesn't have to be absent of sympathy. Like, that conversation can happen. You can talk about kind of both sides of it and be like, wow, that's terrible that happened to you. I'm really sorry, but you know, and so with sympathy, there's still room to kind of question the narrative of events. Empathy says, I'm not going to question the narrative of events. I'm only going to exercise pity at every turn. And so if you want more on this, there's a guy named Joe Rigney, Rigney. If I'm correct, I haven't. I could check my phone, I suppose. So John Piper, during his course of ministry, John Piper's retired now, but during his course of ministry, he founded the Bethlehem College and Seminary, and I believe Joe Rigney has replaced him in that role. Piper's retired, and now Rigney is over in Minneapolis. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to offer a potential pushback on whether empathy is the highest value.
Okay.
I actually think that, or the question, could it be that the appearance of empathy is the highest value? It's more important to be perceived as being empathetic than actually be empathetic.
So Eddie's asked the question, maybe is it because I made the claim earlier that empathy is the highest, sort of the highest virtue, highest importance, and Eddie said, or is it that it's more important to be seen as empathetic, maybe than actually exercising empathy? Probably yes. So this, I think actually you're getting at something that takes us back to the point that Truman makes, which is the problem is there's no consensus about what gets to evoke the most empathy. So is it the baby, Truman says, is it the baby in the womb or the pregnant teenager that doesn't know who to turn to? Well, you could give sympathy to both, couldn't you? I mean, so empathy, well, which one gets our empathy? Well, in our present cultural moment, it's the second one, at the cost sometimes of the life of the baby. He says the transgender teen or his confused and despairing parents. Which one gets the empathy, right? So that's part of the issue in our cultural moment is that everybody agrees. The agreement is that empathy is good. Again, Joe Rigney has written some terrific material on why empathy is not as good as we think it is. So I would direct you to his stuff, and that's so that I don't have to start teaching his material because I want to.
It seems like empathy is post-truth.
Yes. And so another example of how empathy can work would be, Let me think of an example here. If you express something that you believe to be true and it's perceived as hurting somebody's feelings, and so stay with me, it's not just that you're mean, it's that you're actually like, you're morally, ethically wrong. You're less than virtuous for engaging in this argument that has hurt someone but why? Because you failed to be empathetic, to be properly empathetic toward them and understand the pain that you're causing. So at the same time, Rousseau's ethic is rooted in sentiment. So it is rooted in sentiment, but it's not subjective. That's really interesting. Because we're not there yet. We're not to postmodernism yet with Rousseau. And Rousseau, if you could bring the postmodern argument to him and say, doesn't this just make everything morally relative and there's no objective good, he would say, absolutely not. Rousseau believes that everyone has a conscience that says the same stuff. That everyone has a conscience that says the same things. And so guess who mutes or clouds that voice of conscience? Can you guess? Society mutes and clouds that voice of conscience that otherwise would speak clearly and everybody would exercise the appropriate amount of self-love and so on. So for Augustine, because you remember, Augustine believes in a conscience. Christianity believes in the conscience. We believe it's part of natural revelation, that God has given us this expression of who he is in nature. So you go outside, you look around, and I'm stealing this from another theologian, but he says if you go outside and look around and observe nature long enough, you should be able to conclude three things. There is a God, he is big, and he is mad. Those are the three things that nature should teach you, especially when coupled with your conscience, again, which is part of natural revelation, not special or biblical revelation, but natural revelation, that when you commit wrong, you know you've done wrong. So that's part of the conscience. But for Augustine, the conscience is untrustworthy because of sin, because of original sin. And because sin has, we call this the noetic effects of sin. That is, sin has also affected your brain, your ability to rationally process what is true and real and good. So it's not only that you sin, but you have a mental sin fog about what sin and righteousness is. For Rousseau, the conscience is pure, but once you get into a society, it gets real untrustworthy. So another example of Rousseauian ideals would be, this one just occurred to me, would be Tarzan. Right? So Tarzan is this sort of noble ape man, but once he gets placed into this society, that's when he starts. In fact, I remember there was, oh my goodness, I don't know why this is stuck in my brain. I saw it when I was very young, but you had the Jungle Book, which is maybe another example of this, and then, I couldn't have been older than like 11 when the Jungle Book movie came out. It was like a live action, and it was terrible. What I remember of it was terrible. But there was a scene in there where a man is showing Mowgli this knife. This big, scary, nasty knife. And Mowgli basically says, well, what do you do with that thing? And the guy says, well, you put it here, you push it into your enemy, and then he presses a thing on the knife and the blade expands out. And he says, and then you twist a little, right? Really, really kind of dark moment in the movie. And Mowgli says, what's an enemy? The man's kind of taken aback for a moment, and he says, well, an enemy is someone you hate. And Mowgli says, what is hate? Right? It's like this bomb drop of this is the one who's disconnected from society, and he doesn't know what it is to hate, right? That's the Rousseauian man. That's the same idea there. All right, so then true freedom then, of course, for Rousseau is going to be in being yourself, but by that he means your authentic self, not yourself that gets screwed up by amour propre and competition with others. So, in the time we have left, which is about 15 minutes or so, that's kind of an overview of Rousseauian thought for you. Your thoughts, and even as we are going to start moving toward a Christian and biblical response. Mr. Frank.
It's just a rather narcissistic look of looking at life, that the whole world revolves around me, and everybody's out of step with me.
That's a good point, Mr. Frank. What Mr. Frank's pointed out is maybe there's a kind of arrogance here that's able to, as it were, observe the rest of the world from a kind of distant ledge or mountaintop or high horse and say, man, this is how everybody else is messed up. I think there's some of that there, to be sure. It's like that old example. I always appreciate this. Maybe you've heard this one when somebody says, religions is really just like blind men and an elephant, right? And so the one blind guy grabs the trunk and he goes, oh, it's a snake. And one blind guy grabs the leg of the elephant and he goes, no, guys, it's a tree. And then the third blind man kind of touches the midsection of the elephant and he says, no, it's a wall. Right? And so the story goes that these are three blind men, and that's kind of how human beings are with religion and with God, that we're all just kind of blind men grabbing a different part of the elephant. And, who knows what we see or think we see or know or don't know. It's really who can say. And, of course, the unbearable arrogance of this analogy is that the story's being told from the perspective of someone who isn't blind, right? The perspective of someone who, about, say, 50 yards away, is going, look at those three blind men. I can see them, and I can see the whole elephant, right? And so it actually takes a certain kind of arrogance to right, to define religion in such a way. Yeah.
It sounds like all of his views have come from his issue with society at the time. And all of the things he said are just basically taking opposing views of popular ideas.
So-
Going the opposite of what popular thought was.
By that, Stephen, do you mean popular Christian thought?
If there was, I'm not too aware of
Right.
what was going on at the time, but everything he basically said was
Insofar as Rousseau is trying to overturn what we might call, probably I would estimate, the last, 1,500 years before him of Augustinian thought. I probably got that number wrong, maybe 1,400. But again, he is looking back to Augustine, and although he never mentions Augustine in the book in his Confessions, which is interesting. But come on, the asparagus story and the pears story, he bloody well calls it Confessions. It's the parallel's unavoidable. He's looking back at Augustine and he's saying, this is where the problem started, Mr. Saint Augustine, when you made everybody feel terrible, like they are born in sin, as it were. And so, yeah.
I don't see where Rousseau ever dealt with his thought. The glaring fault, the glaring gap in the thought is there's arrogance, but there's also this. How would he define basically good?
How would he define basic good? I'm not sure, Will. That's a...
The Christian understanding of basically good would be a
Well-
heart that desires the things that God desires.
Yes, right. And so I think Rousseau would say that goodness is being your authentic self. And so again, so you're not... And so if you want to know what authentic self means, so an example I might give here is, I like to pick on Disney movies. In Beauty and the Beast, there's the kind of these early scenes with Belle where she's walking through the village and she's reading a book and walking around and everybody's kind of making fun of her and stuff. And the repeated phrase in the song is, there must be something more than this provincial life, right? And so it's this society that's forcing her to live this ordinary, boring, dreary life. And there's gotta be something more. And that's really this expression of my authentic self that has to get out there and live the more, okay?
We're all destined for greatness.
Yeah, well, yeah. That's another thing, yeah, that's part of it. And that's part of why I kind of, what I came to realize after, as I think a lot of us, we grew up watching Disney movies, and it's not until you start studying history a little bit, like the idea that somebody before the Romantic Age would have ever had such thoughts is just ridiculous. The idea that somebody in like the Middle Ages in some Disney movie set in that time would have just had this romantic postmodern longing for life beyond the fence is just, I'm sorry, no. But what that. But they're happy to have a fence, right? It keeps out the Huns. But the reason is because you're that is the influence of your culture, where you start to think, well, of course everyone's always thought that way. Why wouldn't you think that way? And so that's kind of the power of some of this stuff. Yeah, Eddie.
It's easy for us to look at some of the comments like the arrogance or the define good, whatever, to himself. Did he ever deal with? Because I'm not sure if his contemporary. Did he ever answer any contemporaries that you're aware of, or does he even address the simple fact that the self-refuting concept of like, well, the society is corrupting.
Right.
But the society is made up of these people who are basically good.
It's like it's an emergent property of
Right, that's what I was gonna say, never dealt with this problem.
Exactly. So does he ever, or is anyone aware of a contemporary, like that's like literally the next logical question, the first logical question, that someone, like it seems like one of his pupils would have been like, sir,
He died in, yeah, he,
like he's saying when people get together they start competing with each other.
okay.
yeah,
So
exactly.
you're saying that we have a skill coming from inside of them. He's saying that no, if you're by yourself, there wouldn't be any.
So that's the only way
Anything to
you
make
can't
you act
sin is,
evil.
I mean, it's the only way you can be good is if you're not around anybody else. And he said that's not his point, but that is.
Right. And so the point that's being made, the point,
Let being around other people
yeah.
ruin you from not caring about the
But nobody ever managed to do that.
Right. The point that what we're getting at, for those of you who are listening online, is we're kind of trying to explore this. Did he ever solve his problem? Which is like, if the individual is born basically good, then a society is essentially a collection of clean slates. So how the heck do you get from a bunch of clean slates to this big present mess? And I don't think he ever solved that problem, as best I can tell, because he died in 1778. Right, so I mean, we're talking around the time of the American Revolution, and lots of those kinds of ideas floating around. I didn't realize this until I just now Googled him. Cause of death was suicide. So that's my answer to did he ever solve his problem? I would say no, probably not. Lord have mercy. And so,
He's attempted to, like Daniel pointed out.
yeah, to solve his problem, yeah, and so. Right, and what Jen pointed out, that he may have shied away from this, from kind of swallowing the reductio and going all the way and just saying, so everybody isolate yourselves quickly, but that is kind of where it inevitably leads.
But he even says, Rousseau imagines how rivalries, blah, 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 happen in a social context as primitive people gathered around a tree.
Yes,
I mean, like, he
right,
even says it himself, everybody else starts to wish he looked like that.
yeah. Where are you now?
Dance the best, on page 117.
117. Okay.
One who sang or danced the best, or the handsomest, or the strong. Like, even in primitive societies, by his own admission, competition kicks in.
Right. So yeah. So what Jennifer's pointing out, even in a primitive society, he says, so let's say you get a bunch of folks in a tribe out in the middle of the jungle around a tree. Well, you're still going to have the one who sang the best, danced the best, who's the handsomest, who's the strongest, who's the most skillful, most eloquent, and they're going to come to be most highly regarded, and that's going to be the first step toward all the bad stuff. Yeah, again, it's, but what's interesting to me, I think maybe to some this might sound like I'm reducing things too much or oversimplifying, but this is familiar to us. This is essentially at its root, like, it's those people's fault, right? Which goes back to the garden. Yeah. It's these people you gave me that have made me like this. Yeah, it's very biblical. So the next bit, as we begin to wrap up a bit, not gonna quash any further questions, but next we have chapter 4, which chapter 3 was, I think, 25 or 26 pages. Chapter 4 is 32 pages, so not that much more. You should be able to tackle that without too much of a problem. We're going to be talking about Wordsworth, Shelley, and Blake. And so I am going to try to have questions to you via the Facebook group before the weekend, so that we can kind of use those to, I think it was Renee at one of our previous get-togethers who suggested that having questions would help to kind of guide the reading, and that makes good sense. Do any of you have any further questions or comments before we wrap this up? So again, the purpose of this is because, as far as I can tell, a lot of people feel like, what the heck happened in culture and society? And so it's like, well, this is what the heck happened. So at least we're kind of figuring out the roots, and then we'll talk about the fruit and what to do with it. Yeah, Mr. Frank.
These philosophers tried to develop a culture without God.
A culture without God, yes.
If they ever have a happy moment. So I wonder if there was ever time that he felt real happy about something.
I don't know. Mr.
Trying to eliminate God, and it's an exercise in futility for the most part.
Yeah, so I mean, this reminds me of the Apostle Paul, right, who talks about we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Like, that's a really important verse. He doesn't just say we disbelieve. We do. We doubt. He doesn't just say we doubt. We do doubt. We do disbelieve. But he says it's more than that. It's akin to opening up the panel on the computer and just ripping out components, right? So suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. And so that's what we're in the middle of doing. And so anyway, so that's we'll be talking about some different impacts of this. Then I think going into how this affects politics some in chapter 4, which of course is always fun, right? So with that, thank you guys so much. I always enjoy this. Always enjoy the questions and the conversation. I hope it's provoking you to think well about some of these things as much as if it's provoked me to think about them. So with that, then, let's pray. Father, we thank you for the time that you've given us tonight. I ask that you would continue. I pray, Lord, it seems to me that it's possible that something like this might create a sense of just despair. Like there's so much that's gone on, and some of the fruit that's being borne out is so deeply rooted that when we look at some of the problems in our culture, they're 200, 300, 400 years old. Remind us that you are the God who breaks curses, who transforms hearts, and that transforming many nations is not impossible for you. And so give us renewed trust in the God who can change anything, because he's changed us, for heaven's sakes. And so give us faith, Lord. Give us faith, and help us to go out of here tonight with hopeful and faithful hearts. In Jesus' name, amen.